Hi everyone, welcome to Sunday Morning Bible Study with Fifth Avenue Baptist Church for Sunday, April 11th. This is the second Sunday of Easter, and for this month we are going to be studying the prophets of restoration, specifically restoration referring to this time when the people who had been exiled to Babylon come back home to Jerusalem. And what they find there is a city that is still very much destroyed and in need of rebuilding, and a temple that is in need of rebuilding. So they finally get to come back home, but once they get back home, they find out that home is very different than it was before they were exiled. And so they come back to a hard reality. Things have changed. And I think it's really interesting that we are studying prophets of restoration at the same time we are coming out of a hard time and discovering some challenges as we come out of this pandemic. This has been a very difficult season for our world and for our nation. We've learned a lot, are learning a lot, and things are different than they were before the pandemic, and part of our spiritual journey is to look at those differences, to lean into them, and what would God have us do now, which is where the exiles are as they return home. Today we'll be looking at the prophet Ezra. He was a priest and a scribe, a leader, and we'll be looking at his story, specifically Ezra 10 verses 1 through 12. First, we'll immerse ourselves in a little bit of history so we can put ourselves in the book of Ezra, and then we'll be looking at how does this apply to our hearts today. So let's begin with prayer. Giving God, thank you for your generosity to us. Thank you for the hope of resurrection and restoration. Not just things going back to how they were before, but new life in a new season. We pray that you would speak to us through the prophet Ezra and all that he had to say to the people then, and all that you would have to say to us now. In your name we pray. Amen. As I mentioned, the setting is post-exile. So this is going to be in like the 400s, we think of BC, 400 BC, around there. And what happened, just briefly, is there was a period of time where Babylon was the big empire, dominant empire of the age, and they started waging war against the kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel. We remember Israel was a united monarchy for a very short time, and then under King David and King Solomon, and then there was a split. You had the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south, and Judah was where Jerusalem and the temple were. And the Assyrians had already defeated the northern kingdom of Israel. Then the Babylonians came. The Assyrians were once the large empire, then it was the Babylonians, and they start infringing on Judah. And so this takes a matter of time, but finally they get to the capital city and they destroy it. And they take Israel's best and brightest, the leadership, the educated people, the people with strong standing in the society, and they dislocate them. They bring them out, and over time, in basically about 3 different waves, they put those people in Babylon, with the idea being that these people will eventually integrate into Babylonian culture. Of course, they'll always be on the lower rung of Babylonian culture, but they will lose their identity as God's people. And there will be so few of the original inhabitants left in Jerusalem that they won't be able to rebuild, they won't be able to regain their strength, and other tribes, other groups will come and also come and live in that area of Judah and Jerusalem. And so Israel will no longer be a threat of any kind to Babylon. So that's what happens. And so the people are in captivity for quite a long time in Babylon, about 70-ish years. Again, this happened over a period of time, moving the people there. But as so often happens in world history, empires rise and empires fall. So Babylon eventually is defeated by the newest empire, which is Persia. And King Cyrus of Persia has a very different approach to dealing with foreign groups that they've defeated. So he sends the exiles of Judah back home. He doesn't want them anymore to stay where they are. He doesn't see any threat in them going back home and reestablishing themselves in their home territory of Judah. And in fact, King Cyrus tells them, as Ezra tells us in chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, he establishes an edict telling the people, ordering them to go back home. He says, "Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of those among you who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let all survivors in whatever place they reside be assisted by the people of their place with silver and gold, with goods and with animals, besides free will offerings for the house of God in Jerusalem." So this is actually an edict from King Cyrus to go back, and others are supposed to finance this with gold and silver and other offerings and livestock to help the people go back and reestablish Jerusalem, the city, and also specifically the temple. So the people do go back, and again, this sort of happens over time. It's they're traveling by foot, taking all of their stuff back home to Jerusalem. And once they get there, again, what they discover is a city that is still very much in ruins, and that's deliberately how Babylon wanted it, so that the people would no longer be any sort of a threat to Babylon. Well, Persia sees it differently. They want this city to be rebuilt, of course, under their ultimate leadership, because they have a little bit of the attitude that we'll later see in the New Testament of Rome, is that a populace that can have some sort of their own leadership and their own beliefs and their own culture is a happy populace and easier to manage and easier to deal with. And so ultimately, just like Rome later, Persia still holds all the power, but they're letting the people go back home and establish themselves again in their place, and to rebuild the temple. That's their assignment, is to rebuild the temple as well. But that's a big job. That's a really big job. And these exiles have been waiting to go home so long, and they go back and things are in total disarray. And Ezra and Nehemiah both tell this story of what it's like for the exiles to come back home. And not only do they come back home to a destroyed city, but other people, again, have moved in and they have claimed the ancestral lands that belong to the people of Judah. And these other people have come in these 70 odd years and have established themselves and have sort of taken over in parts. And the people of Judah who were still there, there's been intermarrying. And then as the exiles come back, there's been intermarrying as well. And we know that's a real no-no in ancient Israel. And it's not a race issue, it's a religious issue. The idea is that with intermarrying, there will also be the intermixing of the different faiths. And it is the covenant with God that makes Israel a people. It's not just their blood, it's their covenant with God to understand. So we see examples in the Old Testament of people who come into Israel's story, like Ruth, who instead of bringing her own gods of Moab with her and mixing that into the Israel story, which is what the prophets and the leadership of Israel has always been afraid of. They don't want that. They want the covenant to stay true. Ruth leaves behind her old story as a Moabitess, as the King James used to refer to her, or still does refer to her. And so they are able to establish Ruth as a believer within Israel. So she'll always be a Moabitess, but she has adopted the faith of Israel. But that doesn't always happen. When there's intermarrying, sometimes the person who comes from the background of Israel may adopt the gods of the other culture, or there may be a watering down of the two stories. And that is what very much what is a concern all throughout the Old Testament. We have to remember that compared to these other big empires, even at its height, Israel was a small land and a small group of people comparatively. And so there's always the concern of the survival of the faith and the survival of the people. And so they want Israelites marrying other Israelites and keeping the faith true. So there's not that struggle within the marriages around faith, that it's clear for both parties that they worship the God of Israel. So that's always a concern. Well, when the exiles come back home, something really not good happened, which is that some of the men exiles, as they came back home, they discarded the wives of their youth, as the Bible calls them, and families, and married the foreigners who had settled from other places and other tribes who had settled in Jerusalem, because those women from these other traditions, those families now owned the land or had currently claim to the land. And so some of these exiled men who were now coming home abandoned their own families, married into these families that were from elsewhere, and in so doing were unfaithful to the covenant, unfaithful to their families that they already had, and unfaithful to God, because they were going against all of the guidance of protecting the faith and staying true to the faith and true to the covenant. And it was not as if they were marrying these foreign women because there was no one else to marry. Plenty of people came back in the exile, and these men were abandoning their own families in order to marry into these foreign families so that they could have a stake in the power of the land and to actually own land again and reclaim it. So in so doing, though, they were also mixing faith. They were going against the covenant that they had through marriage, the covenant they had as a people, and then their covenant with God. So this was a real problem. And part of Ezra's work as the people come back is to reestablish some of the religious traditions that had been lost when they went to Babylon, and to reestablish, okay, what does it mean now that we're back home? How do we worship as this different people? Because we're different from when we left, and generations have passed, and yet we are still God's people. So what does that look like now? So that's what Ezra's dealing with as he tries to lead in this time. Things have changed, and they need to figure out, what does it mean for us now to follow God in this broken land that needs to be rebuilt, when some of our own male leaders are turning against the families of their youth and marrying these younger women and starting foreign women and starting families with them and leaning into this different culture and this different faith. So that's what's going on when Ezra speaks these words in chapter 10, which is near the end of the book. And we'll be looking at how he addresses this, and then what does that mean for us. So he's got a pretty dramatic way of addressing it. And there's someone that who actually comes up with the technical idea. His name is Shechaniah. We don't know much else about him, but he appears in this part of Ezra. So this is Ezra 10, verses 1 through 12. While Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God. He's weeping and throwing himself down and confessing because he realizes how far the people have fallen, especially these males who are doing this, from who God has called them to be as his people. So Ezra is expressing that on behalf of the people. So while he's weeping in this very public way, the children gathered to him at the assembly of women, men, and children gathered to him out of Israel, and the people also wept bitterly. So he had called people to come and to hear his address. He has something to say to them, and he's telling them they've really made some serious errors, and those errors have to be addressed. Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, of the descendants of Elam, addressed Ezra, saying, "We have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land, but even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. So now let us make a covenant with our God to send away these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord, and for those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Take action, for it is your duty, and we are with you. Be strong and do it." Then Ezra stood up and made the leading priests, the Levites, and all of Israel swear that they would do as had been said. So they swore. So let's pause right now. So the solution that Shechaniah comes up, and he is obviously a respected leader of the people, but we don't know much else about him because he sort of speaks on behalf of everybody. And he confesses that they have done this wrong, and they have married these foreign women, and they've been with them long enough to create children. They have new families, and they've discarded their other families. And the solution that Shechaniah comes up with is, well, now we'll discard these new families and send them away back to their own families. They're not just abandoning them. We'll send them back to their own families. And we will do what we should have done in the first place, which is stay faithful to our wives and stay faithful to our children and stay faithful to who we are as God's people, and not throw all that away so that we can become reestablished here with this new group who is here. So Ezra then prepares. You'll notice that he makes the Levites, the priest leadership, and all the people there swear that they will abide by this. In other words, it's not just some of the people will go back to their old families, but everybody has to do it together because they've all wronged God and their families and their faith and the covenant with this behavior. So in verse 6, Ezra withdrew from before the house of God and went to the chamber of Jehohanan, son of Eliashib, where he spent the night. He did not eat bread or drink water, for he was mourning over the faithlessness of the exiles. They made a proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem to all the returned exiles that they should assemble at Jerusalem, and that if any did not come within 3 days, by order of the officials and the elders, all their property should be forfeited, and they themselves banned from the congregation of exiles. Verse 9. So again, they're gathering all these people in to come make this confession together. It's a national confession. The people of Israel are coming together to confess, yes, we're back home, and we have still not been following what God would have us to do, especially through this practice of rejecting the families that they had in order to marry these new wives. Verse 9, then all the people of Judah and Benjamin, those are the two tribes that make up Judah, assembled at Jerusalem within the 3 days. It was the 9th month on the 20th day of the month, and all the people sat in the open square before the house of God, trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, "You have trespassed and married foreign women, and so increased the guilt of Israel. Now make confession to the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the foreign wives." Then all the assembly answered with a loud voice, "It is so. We must do as you have said. But the people are many, and it is a time of heavy rain. We cannot stand in the open. Nor is this a task for a day or two, for many of us have transgressed in this matter." So it goes on a little bit longer as they try to figure this out. But they do so. The men of Israel who have sinned in this particular way do confess, and they do turn back to God, and they give up their new families and send them back home to their original homes under their fathers. And so again, they don't abandon them and wash their hands of them and leave them to, starve in the street. These are actual, these women were coming from families that had taken over the land that Israel had left. And so they are people of means. They would be going back to families who would take care of them. But still, that was a separation that I imagine was very painful and difficult. They had children together with these people. They had a relationship. They had married them. But in this culture, in this time frame, what the people had done was turn from one covenant with God and with the original families that they had, the wives of their youth and the offspring from that story. And they had instead married these other people. So they were creating new allegiances, new alliances, new commitments that they had no right to make. They had no right to make those commitments. They had already committed to someone else and to the God of Israel, who had brought them out of exile back home after all this time, who had answered all of their prayers and brought them back home. What do? Being the humans that they are, once they get home, they still mess up, just as we humans always do. But I appreciate the fact that Ezra calls them on the carpet about this and says, this isn't okay. This is not who God has shaped us to be. God has been faithful to us, and in turn, we were once again faithless to God by trying to make our own way to reestablish ourselves in the land through these marriages, and abandoning God and abandoning the wives of our youth and our children from those marriages. And that was wrong. Now, one of the things our literature brings up is, were there any other solutions that might have happened? Because this is a pretty complex problem. The children have been born because of these new marriages. And then you also have former families that have been betrayed and abandoned. And so this is a very complex situation. And there were probably other ways to try to work on that problem. But the way that Shechaniah comes up with, that Ezra accepts, and ultimately the people accept, is they realize, whoa, this is not going to get us what we want, and we are not being faithful to God doing this way. So it's time for us to do things differently. And so they go back and they turn away from those foreign marriages and return to the covenant. And I imagine, again, that was very painful. We don't get the whole story of exactly what that looked like. I imagine there was a lot of pain in that story. But for those who had been unfaithful to their original covenant, marriage covenant, and the covenant with God, that was important for them to do that work, to acknowledge the wrong that they had done and try to make it right. So we can think, as modern believers, we can think of probably some ways possibly to stand in the middle and acknowledge the wrong without abandoning the other family, the new family. Again, to be clear, these would have been people who, these wives would have come from probably landed people who had taken over the land, and so they weren't abandoned in the street. They were returned back to their own families. And the writers pointed out, and I appreciated this, that Shechaniah says that this should be done in verse 3 according to the law, so that when the men, the Israel exiles, divorce these second wives that they had, that they would be sending them back free to marry other people. They don't just leave them. they are doing it according to the law, which would have required them officially ending that relationship in an official way so that those women could remarry then. And of course, they're from another tradition, a faith tradition, and they would have been free to remarry and establish new families. So certainly we can't tie this up and put a neat little bow on it. Very complex situation. But it strikes me that so many of our situations as humans are complex because we're complex creatures, each of us alone, and then you put a lot of us together and the complexity multiplies. And we often have competing priorities, competing commitments. We get ourselves into sticky situations all the time. And in our own world, we've just recently seen this. It was hard for us as Americans to even decide, okay, we're going to wear masks to protect one another from the coronavirus. We struggled with that. There's still some debate about that. And it is hard for us to make decisions sometimes that might inconvenience us, but would bless others. When we look at this situation in Ezra, we can be very sympathetic to the new wives and say, oh my goodness, they abandoned them. They sent them back home and they would have had to say goodbye to these children. That's a terrible situation. But we also need to hold that together with the original terrible situation, which was these men abandoning their first families. And those wives probably would have been too old to remarry. Would have been much harder. And so both situations are difficult. And the solution that Shechaniah comes up with might not be the ideal solution that we would come up with today. But it's in so much of life, there aren't easy answers and there aren't cut and dried. Here's how we're going to do this and it's going to be the perfect solution. There are very few perfect solutions in the world. And yet our faith asks us to figure out, okay, perfect isn't an option here on this earth, but good is an option. And at this time and in this culture and this story in Ezra, this is the solution they came up with. You have to say goodbye to these marriages where you have turned your back against God and reestablish yourselves by doing the hard work of rebuilding Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple, not by taking a shortcut by marrying into the newly landed foreign people in this area, just so you can get back your heritage land. Because in a sense, it's no longer your heritage land if you've given up your covenant with God. That's the whole reason you had this land in the first place, is through the covenant with God. So I encourage us as we think about this complex situation here to think about a couple of things. One is all of this happened over a period of time. And so we're looking at it, centuries and centuries and centuries later. So we can look at it and say, oh my goodness, I can't believe they did that. That was their solution. That was the best they could come up with. But when we're in a situation, sometimes it's very hard to see the next right step. My guess is that years later, people will study what happened this past year in this pandemic in America and around the world, and things will seem much clearer. If you lived through it, you'll remember how complex it is. If you're looking at it later, you'll say, well, it seems so cut and dried. Why didn't they do A, B, and C, X, Y, and Z? And that just would have kept so many of these people who died from dying. Well, in the moment, we were fighting with each other over what best steps to take to protect each other. We were fighting over rights and responsibilities. There was incredible political turmoil. It was a hard season. And part of our work may be confession. confessing some of the ways where we may have not been as faithful as we could have been during this pandemic, where we may have put our personal desires and our personal preferences above the well-being of the whole community, where we may have looked at our brothers and sisters with deep judgment instead of with compassion, or with a call to love them even though we disagreed, and to disagree in such ways that says, I care about you and I'm concerned about this. That is difficult, very difficult. And sometimes we need leaders like Shechaniah to step up and say, here's how I think we should solve this. We should do X, Y, and Z. And then other leaders in the community and the community themselves can step up and say, okay, well, here's where I see that that's a really good thing, and here's where I think there could be some complications. And that's what we have to work through as a people, both as citizens of the United States of America and then within the family of God. And that's not easy. And it takes courage and commitment and covenant, reminding ourselves that we are one body in Jesus Christ, and our personal preferences do not have the last word. That what is right in loving God and loving our neighbors as ourselves, that takes precedence over what I personally would prefer. And the most loving thing that Shechaniah could come up with was to confess the wrong that had been done and try to right it. I think that's really hard for us as humans. Again, sometimes we want a perfect answer, or sometimes we want to just pretend that the wrong that was done isn't so wrong. Well, it was. These people who gave up their first families, rejected their first families to create a second family so that they could have access to this land, that was about greed and pride and privilege. Those women couldn't reject their husbands and marry in for this. The men could do that. And those first families that depended on them were left out in the cold. Sometimes the enemy of the good is the perfect, and sometimes we don't want to look at the wrongs that we have been a part of, or that we have personally done or done as a community. And of course we don't. That's hard work. And yet it's work we're called to do. And I believe as we come out of this pandemic, we will be able to see things more clearly as we look back, sort of like we can see things more clearly in Ezra, perhaps, than those who were immediately going through the problem, because they were there with all of the feelings and all of the complexities and all of the nuances of that situation. So I pray that we can have grace for those who went before us, who were doing the best they could with the situations that they had and situations they had helped create. We too are often doing the best that we can with tough situations. This past year has been complex and difficult and challenging and exhausting. My prayer for us is that as we look back at Ezra, we can have grace and compassion for them doing the best that they could with a very tough situation. I pray that we can have that grace and compassion for one another in this season, as many of us are doing the best we can with very complex, challenging situations. And I pray that we will also have the grace to be able to look at the places where we realize now that we could have done things very differently, and maybe should have done things very differently. I pray that we'll do that instead of doubling down. In this passage from from Ezra, the people could have said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not turning back to God. We're not turning back to our original families and reconciling with them. We're going to continue to reject them. But they didn't. They allowed themselves to be changed. And maybe it wasn't perfect and neat, but they were trying. I pray that we will allow ourselves to be changed, that we will allow ourselves to confess where we Maybe we're doing things that did not honor God or our neighbor. Maybe with our attitudes, maybe with our words, maybe with our actions. May we be courageous enough to take a good hard look and confess, and gracious enough to accept God's forgiveness and to forgive one another. None of this is easy, and yet it is the way of the people of God to continue growing, learning, forgiving, and offering grace to ourselves that Jesus offers to us. Brothers and sisters, in these coming days, may we have the courage to confess where we need to confess, and the grace to forgive ourselves and one another. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for being with us. I look forward to seeing you next week.